super important to me is around legitimacy. And what I mean by that is I don't think people are even making assumptions right now about whether the piece of work they're putting this data to, in other words, the AI application that they're building, they have any legitimacy to do that. Are they the right person to do it? Who are the communities that this technology is going to affect? And do those communities accept you as a legitimate person to create this technology in this way and use it on them?
Welcome to Mindful AI, the podcast that delves into the world of AI and its responsible use and development. I'm your host, Natasha Fong. I'm the founder of Zenta, a provider of mindfulness programs for workplaces. In this podcast, we'll hear from thought leaders in tech industry, academia, and mindfulness so that the layperson like myself can be smarter when thinking about the important topic of mindfulness in AI development and use. My guest today is Ruth Marshall. Ruth has spent the past 25 years moving between collaborative research and corporate communities, and she's got a background in software and artificial intelligence. In the earlier half of her career, Ruth was responsible for product development and R&D in companies including Accenture, Harvey Norman, and Novartis Pharmaceuticals. In more recent years, Ruth has been immersed in the world of data-related legislation and ethics. As Director R&D and Data Integrity at Australian online platform company Practera, Ruth was responsible for establishing the processes and developing the necessary corporate skills and culture for the responsible use of the company's data and compliance with data privacy legislation. This led to a 3-year collaborative research project to implement an ethical framework for data analytics in learning and the development of skills programs for data creators, users, and consumers. She's now co-founder of a data literacy and ethics education initiative at Hocone, where she works with organizations to develop frameworks and education programs for the responsible use of data. In the past year, she delivered workshops on data privacy and ethics to demystify these in the wider community and was engaged by the New South Wales Government to outline an approach and framework for responsible data use across the organisation. Ruth is also an expert contributor to the International Standard on Data Usage, which is due to be published later this year. Ruth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Ruth, can you start by giving me a brief background of your interest and experience with AI ethics?
My background, I go back, it's probably more than 25 years now. I ought to update my bio, but I did a computing and AI degree in the mid-80s in the UK at the University of Sussex. And that was a very different iteration of AI. It had a very cognitive science framing to it. It was very much looking at all sorts of areas that are in AI already or now, symbolic reasoning, learning, computer vision, language, etc. But look at using them as models to sort of better understand human intelligence, human cognition. So that was one camp. And then another camp was also just to see how we could model the way we externally look like and modeling the way we do things intelligently to try and make computers do things more intelligently. So it also sort of sounds like what we're doing now, and it is. We were doing neural networks, robotics, vision, etc. And the hype was insane, right? If you think it's bad now, there was people, Marvin Minsky, who was like the real daddy of AI, some people would say, even back as far as 1970, I think, was saying within the next 5 to 10 years, you know, we're going to have intelligent machines, as intelligent as humans and so on. But what wasn't there was the computing power. So I think that's been a big difference. The computing power and 30 plus years of additional research has really transformed AI, but all the roots were there. So I went out of there into various startups using AI technology, and I'll skip ahead a few years. And as you said, I've been in online learning platform in business, running their R&D, AI-driven research in learning analytics. I'm trying to understand how people learn online and increasingly involved in and responsible for data privacy and ethics within that space. So where I'm really coming from now is the legitimacy of the AI research that people do and the applications that they put it to, and how we can protect people's interests as this technology is developed. And it's not all about big, scary, sentient AI beings coming in to destroy us, which seem to be on the front pages of the news every day, but just the day in, day out use of that data, and is it eroding people's individual rights and also their independence in some regards?
With that history, with your experience in this area, I am interested in diving into what you think are the biggest concerns with AI and data privacy, and how can companies address these?
I think it was the Times in the UK publicizing this letter that's gone around now, 350 AI scientists saying that the end of the world is nigh if we don't get control of our AI, and need to start treating it as another existential threat alongside global warming, etc. We can talk about those sorts of threats in a minute. And I think there's a lot of very immediate threats. And in fact, that they've been ongoing for quite a while now, and it hasn't been well publicized up until recently. For me, first and foremost, is that about privacy and legitimacy. So everyone's jumping on the AI bandwagon, making automated decision-making solutions, which do two things. Any AI, any analytics create data, create new information. So although a lot of information is being now protected, a lot of effort's been put into protecting information on the way in, right? As you collect that data from consumers and students or citizens, not a lot of thinking is going into how we protect that data on the other side, the new information that we create about these people by building these models. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done end to end to really protect people's privacy. So that's one of my concerns and something I work on day to day. The piece that goes with that I think is less talked about again, but super important to me, is around legitimacy. And what I mean by that is, I don't think people are even making assumptions right now about whether the piece of work they're putting this data to, in other words, the AI application that they're building, they have any legitimacy to do that. Are they the right person to do it? Who are the communities that this technology is going to affect? And do those communities accept you as a legitimate person to create this technology in this way and use it on them? All of those things are, I think, essential for ongoing trust to be kept within the community between customers and their suppliers, and also governments and their citizens, right? If citizens do not feel that their data is being put to legitimate use, or that even if it's a good use, that the right people are not involved in that process, then trust will be eroded and we're going to start having some real problems. So I think that's something that really hasn't had a lot of attention at all, and we need to start talking about.
It's very interesting, this topic of legitimacy. Can you give a bit of color, a bit of an example of where you've seen a concern with legitimacy?
Right. I think, what kicked me down this path, really thinking about it much more deeply, I think people, when they're confronted with the whole idea, sort of go, I guess I've thought about it peripherally, but I haven't really given it some serious consideration. I actually just read a blog post from a water charity that was providing clean water to African countries. And they were doing a lot of research, a lot of AI-based research, number crunching and what have you, around the communities that they were serving, to try and better understand how to adapt the technologies that we're using and how behavior was affecting access to clean water in different areas. And but more than that, they weren't really doing a lot of research, they were doing a lot of projects. And they're saying, are we the right people to be marching into these organizations, into these communities, and telling them how to organize their lives in order to get more reliable water sources in their environment? So even outside of the context of AI, there's a question of moving into another space and having a legitimate role to play there and being accepted by the groups that you're working with as legitimate allies and partners, or guides even, to take them through this new space. Many groups across the world that really have given this a lot of thought are the Indigenous data sovereignty groups that have been developing over the last several decades or two in Canada, the US, parts of Northern Europe, where there are large Indigenous communities, here in Australia and in New Zealand, all at varying levels of sort of completion. Legitimacy is a really important concept that they're putting a lot of thought into, and they all have one thing in common, and that is that European settlers at some point that very illegitimately came into their world and started reorganizing their lives in very often very violent and detrimental ways. And so that question of legitimacy has always been there with them. So it's very natural then to put that when you're looking at data sovereignty and this is our data, what are you doing with it? Do you have any right to be munching our data and creating insights about us? And at what point do you need to hand that over to us and give us that control, because we actually know what we're doing. We're the ones that have the legitimate rights to be doing that analysis, and also involving us in looking at the results of your analysis or looking at the outcomes of your AI projects to validate those and say, yes, they're correct, we accept them, they're legitimate, and we believe that they'll be of beneficial use to us. So I think we can learn a lot from those initiatives and hopefully start incorporating some of that thinking into sort of the wider community. They're real leaders.
Absolutely. Very important to think about. So incorporating legitimacy into this thinking, what are your thoughts around the frameworks and the methodologies that companies should be ensuring they adhere to or are guided by when they're developing these tools?
So existing ones, or what should the ingredients of a good framework be?
Ingredients of the...
So I think, what I think, so we can talk in a minute, I guess, about other frameworks that exist already. There are quite a few, but in terms of what I think the basic ingredients of a methodology or a framework needs to be, the first and foremost, don't do it without a reason. So there needs to be some way of justifying what it is that you're doing, and it can't just be because it's there, right? We're not climbing a mountain. So everyone that's involved, including the subjects of that AI, the people that are actually donating the data, and everybody else in between, needs to arrive at some agreement that this needs to be done and that it's a legitimate use. Don't let FOMO drive your strategy. There's a lot of fear right now, especially in corporate world, that if you're not doing AI, you're going to get left behind, you're going to be high and dry. Well, doing a bunch of AI that's not actually serving a real purpose is just sucking up dollars and isn't going to get you any further anyway. So that's not a good enough reason to start embarking on an AI project. So that's first and foremost. Build privacy into the solution from the start. There's a lot of good technology being developed right now and productized with the large vendors, the Microsofts of this world and the Googles of this world, that treat data privacy in a really good systematic way. There's technologies like homomorphic encryption, which allow you to work on fully encrypted data. So you can actually perform encrypted operations on encrypted data without requiring any encrypting at any point. There's multi-party compute solutions where you can keep the data distributed and actually just send the algorithm back to the data rather than converging all the data in one spot, and so on and so forth. All of those things are good, legitimate pieces of a good privacy solution. And you need to think that stuff up front, right at the very beginning, and plan that in. And don't be a data hoarder. Right? Don't hoard the data because you might have some magic AI solution that's going to put you in front of the marketplace at some point. Collect the data you need. Have the best people and tools. I would say that a requirement of an AI framework would be the vetting and education of your data people, your AI algorithm people, and your domain. So you need data experts that understand the data, understand how doing various different treatments of them, or even the data selection process is going to affect the outcome, understanding what's not in there, what's underrepresented, how do you interpret the metrics or the data that comes out the other side. You need really good algorithm experts that really understand the nuances, whatever the tool and technique it is that you're using, and how to interpret the results of those as well, and how to test for the validity and for the predictive capabilities of that technology, if relevant. And because those tools are proliferating everywhere now. Anybody can graduate from uni or not, have a very minimal knowledge of what they're doing, download some AI algorithms and toolkits, tweak a few parameters, right, change a few weights, and away you go. And you'll just, garbage in, garbage out. You won't have reliable results that way. You need to figure out how you're going to have good practitioners in that regard. And then you need people who understand the domain that you're working in, preferably the lived experience of the people that are actually going to be subjects of the analytics that you're doing, so that they can actually go back and pin this whole stuff in reality and say that that's accurate and correct, or no, it's not, and this is working for us, or no, it isn't. You need external checks and balances. I don't know if you've ever read Cathy O'Neill's book, The Weapons of Math Destruction. Mm-hmm. I thoroughly recommend it. It's a really good read. She talks about pernicious feedback loops, where by the very actions that you take as a result of a prediction will then reinforce the very data that you're measuring. And so you end up in this pernicious feedback loop. And a good example is police crime hotspots. There's a big trend a few years ago of police systems that would look at various data and come up with crime hotspots and say, these are the crime hotspots. We're going to concentrate all our police here. And obviously, the more police in that area, the more crime will be discovered, simply because there's more eyes there, which will reinforce that this is a crime hotspot. And then for more police, and this is this pernicious feedback loop that you're actually creating the data that's then feeding and reinforcing your system. And you're also then probably having all sorts of knock-on effects that also drive up crime, such as stigmatizing, harassing, putting more people in prison for petty crimes that are discovered, and therefore increasing the crime profile of the neighborhood. So external validation of that data from a different source is essential, and constant monitoring of the AI once the model's built and the systems deployed. We don't need to talk about Robert to say, constant monitoring is no good without a plan of action and a commitment to act if and when, and I would say actually when something goes wrong, because it always does. So have a plan for detecting when things will go wrong, figuring out how you're going to correct it, how you'll ameliorate damage that has been done, and how you'll change things to avoid them happening in the future. And as part of that, you need a use-by date for your AI, especially if it's not getting regular updates, because things change, circumstances and context change, and that could change how that system is actually working or how effective it is in any time. So you need to keep going back and making sure that all of the criteria that were relevant at the beginning to make this solution work are still relevant and nothing's changed. In terms of what needs to be in any framework, I've probably missed half a dozen things as well, but I think those are really core to any framework that you'd want to use.
That makes a lot of sense to me, that the core parts of the framework. So you've got the 3 Ps, the purpose, privacy, the people, and wrapped around that is the external checks and validations with an expiry date.
And legitimacy. Do you need to do it in the first place? And are you the right person to do it?
Right. What do you see are some of the potential challenges and limitations of developing AI mindfully, both for businesses and society as a whole?
The biggest challenge right now, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, is that we're not going to have what people are worried about. In fact, Rodney Brooks, who was got famous in the 80s and 90s, he's like the robotics king, right? He really sort of started this whole embodied AI movement with his little robots. And his robots really were trained to do what looked like extremely sophisticated stuff, right, in teams, right? They worked in little groups and moved things around and what have you, but they had a very limited set of instructions. But together, they kind of worked sort of like ants in an anthill or something. They looked like an extremely sophisticated unit of little robots doing quite sophisticated tasks. And so he knows all about things looking competent, but actually they're just very simple things that do them in the right way and can appear to us to be much smarter and more competent than they really are. And even experts like Rodney Brooks can be fooled, right? They can go to ChatGPT and ask it some questions and be completely blown away by the sophistication of the answer, and therefore ascribe capabilities and intelligence to it that really don't exist. And the biggest danger there, the real challenge is identifying actually what these things can and can't do, and having a realistic idea of what they are, because the most immediate danger of, probably is actually already happening, is people putting these things to uses that they're really not equipped to do. And that can be quite dangerous, obviously, if you're starting to affect people's lives or health. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now, is how to address that uniformly, because this stuff is becoming ubiquitous, right? And that kind of is the second piece I was going to say. There's people developing open source versions, even though ChatGPT is open source, alternative versions of ChatGPT. There's a lot of work going on. Everyone's in the chase to develop AI models now, and of various different kinds. So you can't put that genie back in the bottle. So what are the tools that we're going to use to verify the quality of the products that are being developed, and to understand the provenance of some of the products that are being developed, so that we can actually go back and say that we have confidence that it can do A, B, and C. These are the prescribed tasks that it should do, and that it can do those with some level of competence, and that we don't have people using them for other things. And this is the problem, right? So you can get onto ChatGPT, you can get onto all these other sites and start using them. You've got API access to them. There's people building control sort of layers on top as well, which, because, you know, you've got these very different specialized uses or capabilities within, even within ChatGPT, that it's trained on. So, you know, bodies of knowledge. And you're getting these control pieces that sit across the top now that can sort of switch between them depending on what sort of information you want, or what body of knowledge you're looking for. How do you stop people now using that stuff for things that it's really not reliable enough to be used? I don't have an answer to that question, but it's definitely, to me, one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is the proliferation of this technology with very little quality control and very little insight as to where a lot of these things came from, how they were developed. And so it's both challenges because of its limitations, and how we overcome them, I'm not quite sure. And this is where we get back to frameworks and methodology and the law to some extent. There's got to be some process by which we professionalize this whole thing. So we're not a profession, right? We're sort of, the whole software, AI, engineering world is not a profession. There are no requirements apart from perhaps having a degree, perhaps from a good university, depending on who you go and work for. There's no specific curriculum that everybody has to even follow. And I'm not saying that you have to necessarily be degree qualified, but I do think there needs to be some mechanism for saying these people pass the bar, have at least some foundational knowledge about the tools that they're using, the importance of understanding the provenance of data and the statistical qualities of data and how you test for those, how you validate your results. So I think there needs to be some movement to move the AI, if not even wider engineering community, into a profession. I know there's a lot of work that's been done along those lines, and we all have, Institute of Electrical Engineering and an Institute of so on and so forth. But I think that needs to be legislated now, or at least more emphasis put on it, so that we can start getting some reliability in that regard with certain professional standards. The other is we need to have some form of registering AI solutions to validate that they have gone through certain tests and verifications before they can be used in any kind of really consequential way. And again, that's going to always be opt-in. There's always going to be bad actors out there who are using it for other things. And there's obviously nothing we can do about that. But where people are going to start using algorithms and AI to do legitimate uses within their own applications or in government, there needs to be some kind of way of registering and having a sort of verifiable quality control over those as well.
It's good to hear you talk about that top-down approach. In a previous episode with Dr. Michael Colo, he was talking about the bottom-up with the education around usage. So this is a nice balance to that.
Absolutely. And that's also essential in data literacy education as well.
So where do you see the biggest knowledge and action gaps in using AI ethically? And how can that be addressed?
The biggest knowledge and action gaps. So this is the bottom-up stuff. People may disagree, but I still believe, and I came from AI years ago, 90% of AI is data. The reason AI wasn't huge in the 80s, the computing power wasn't there, but also there wasn't the data. The internet hadn't really happened. Well, we were using it for email and chat rooms, but it just created this wealth of data that just didn't exist before. So it's all about the data. It's about data management, preparation, provenance, fitness, the metadata, bringing all that together. Who's represented in that data? Who's underrepresented? What kind of data treatments do you have to do so that the really smaller groups still get seen by the AI, right? By the training mechanism that you're using. So do you have to then maybe find ways of blowing all that data set out considerably using differential privacy and various other things, not to necessarily protect privacy, but to actually give you a better representative data set? They're all questions that are still being asked today. So the data is a very big one. And that's something that I think is a big knowledge gap. People just haven't got enough data literacy, in my perspective, to do that work. And we as consumers don't have enough data literacy to really critically assess the results of some of the analysis that's done and decide whether or not it's good analysis and whether we should accept the results. Back to legitimacy again, I think there's very little discussion around legitimate use of this data, legitimate use of AI for a certain purpose. We see what the downside of that is in our own horror stories. Robo-debt and things like that. Was that a legitimate use? I don't think anybody would say it was. You can't automate everything and not have some serious sort of fallout from that. Part of that, I think, also is co-creation. And again, legitimacy and co-creation go hand in hand, I think. Without establishing that legitimacy, you are risking a real breakdown in trust across the board. We're already seeing massive breakdowns in trust across the world, really. Trust in corporations, trust in government. This is only going to make that worse if we don't bring all of the parties together that are affected by this AI and make sure that the people who are the subjects of this work are a part of the work through co-creation, through providing verification and validation at the end, and through establishing constant feedback loops so that if and when it goes off the rails, they're getting early warning from the community, and then the community sees that being responded to. So that's a big piece that's probably not well known. The other thing that's kind of creeping up for me, and it's a very slightly different area, is monopolies, the creation of monopolies. AI was monopolized to some extent by the large Googles and and what have you, because of the compute power that was required at the time. It was really not affordable outside of academia or these large organizations. There's a lot of compute power coming down the pipe. NVIDIA just did this big release, much publicized, about their accelerated AI, highly parallelized platforms, and making it far less costly to train models like ChatGPT. And algorithm improvements and what have you is also making it more efficient anyway. So more and more people can have access to this technology. And the flip side of trying to get the quality piece right, all the problems that I talked about earlier, is over, and then really making it impossible for players other than the big players that are already involved participating in the whole thing, because it's just going to be too costly, too many barriers to getting involved. The fines and the risks are too high. So we need to find a way of having those quality controls and frameworks and protective legislation in place without hardening the barriers to getting involved and really setting these monopolies in concrete in a way that was going to sort of fix them in place.
It seems pretty complex to strike that balance.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to take bigger brains than me to work that out. It is a real tightrope. I think a lot of it is about education and frameworks that are permissive. It's about educating and giving people the capability to make the right decisions, not about making it impossible to do the work without, paying a huge price.
I'm going to ask a question that I wouldn't know how to answer, but how would we be able to gauge what direction that's going, like with the whole trust and
Well, I think trust is a big one. We don't really want to measure trust because we've already screwed it up. If trust starts going down, we kind of want to pick it up before then. I think it depends on what we're trying to measure. So if we're measuring the success of, let's say, a AI application, well, again, it goes back to the original piece we were discussing. We need, right from day one, when we build the thing, we need to very clearly document and understand what it is that we're trying to do. So what are we trying to achieve? Once we've determined that it's a legitimate thing to do, it's like any experimental design. Put our intent down at the beginning and then set up a testing and validation routine that really gets activated once it's gone live, right? To get regular data points and feedback, and not a pernicious feedback loop where you're only testing your original source data again and seeing whether numbers have gone up or down in order to verify that it's actually achieving those outcomes. So you want to measure, is it moving the needle that you wanted to move with this solution in the right direction? But then you want to also say, have a process in place for testing and what the unintended consequences of doing that are. And I'm not the first person to say this. We can look at the health industry and pharma in particular, medical sciences, to get some sort of guidance on that. So, when new drugs are approved and go on the market, there's a monitoring phase, and it can be a year, it can be 5 years, it can be longer, depending on the potential side effects of the drug and the perceived safety of it. And it goes on as long as that drug is being prescribed anyway. There's a mechanism for collecting information about adverse events. It's mandatory reporting of adverse events depending on the drugs. But even before an early stage, there might be mandatory regular reporting on every single person that's prescribed that drug and how they're tolerating it and various other things. So there are ways in which other industries do this that we can borrow from. And there are things that they don't do well, which we should do well and get ahead of them. And that is lived experience. And that is about gathering social identifiers that are going to tell you whether there's any unforeseen circumstances, what else is being changed that shouldn't that wasn't intended to be changed by putting the system in place, so that you can then evaluate whether or not you need to change strategies as a result.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So it makes a lot of sense to refer back to your original goals. And then the piece you said about the external checks, the lived experience, weaving that back into that as a balance to how these regulations are shaped and making sure it's not so highly regulated to be
Impossible. And some of that is, with great power comes great responsibility. And so that responsibility means you need to keep monitoring, because also the world changes, things change.
Yeah.
You've built models around one world, and then COVID happens and nobody's working from their office anymore, and a million other things have changed. You need to forever be testing, is the world the same as the world that my model perceives? And is the context the same? Because any of that might change the impact. A good example is Parents Next, which I believe from reading papers has recently just been banned now, which was the program that was monitoring parental payments, government payments, mainly to young single parent, often families with children under the age of 6. And here's an example of the model might have been fine. What it was doing was automating the process of accruing a demerit points up to, I think, 5 or 6 points if the recipient of these payments was non-compliant in some way. Then an automatic set of penalties would trigger after a certain number of points within a certain period of time, say 6 points within 6 months. I don't know if that's accurate, but it was close to that. And it would start reducing the payments and then would eventually cut them off entirely. Now, all of that may have been accurate, unlike Robodebt, which was just calculating nonsense numbers out of averages. It may or may not have been correct, I don't know. But one of the things it was relying on was a self-reporting compliance from the recipient over some mobile phone app. And apparently one of the most common triggers for these demerit points to accrue was not reporting compliance through your app. There could be any number of different reasons why they didn't do that. It might not have had anything to do with the fact that they weren't compliant. They just didn't remember. They had other things on their mind. They lost their phone, whatever. So that scenario, again, that's an unexpected consequence. It's not what they thought was going to happen. And they certainly didn't intend for people to start getting demerits because they didn't have their mobile phone on them or for whatever other reason. And inevitably, it's the most vulnerable people that were worst affected, young mums, often single parent, and so on. So there's a lot more to your AI solution than the validity of the algorithm itself and the data that it was trained on. There's also the world that you put it into and how the people, the society that it's put into works around it. So validating externally all of that and how it's going is essential. You can't anticipate what all those different scenarios would be that might make it not work as it did in the lab. So again, goes back to why clinical trials are required even after it's worked in the lab.
It goes back to your thoughts on frameworks, the external validation and the expiry element. We've come full circle. I'm really glad.
Magic.
Ruth, just a final question. I'm curious who or what kind of sources you follow for AI updates.
We do have some local people that I follow. I follow on Twitter as well as elsewhere. AI practitioner Toby Walsh, who I'm sure you've heard of. He's great. Simon Buckingham-Shum is somebody who's extremely knowledgeable in the learning analytics space, as well as Dr. Abelardo Pardo in the University of South Australia. Simon Buckingham-Shum's at UTS. They're great sources if you're into learning analytics and that kind of AI. Cathy O'Neill, I mentioned, she wrote that great book, Weapons of Math Destruction, and really woke the non-technical world up to the potential dangers of AI. Again, it's nearly all data, those issues that she was talking about, data and poor practice, no validation post-production. So I like to keep up with what she's talking about. She tends to be invited to very interesting talks and participate in some good programs. Natasha Crampton at Microsoft, AI ethicist, and she's very interesting. Toby Stallworth, who's a data and AI ethicist, has some very interesting things to say, is very well connected and also just been working in ethics in this space for a very long time. So I've missed a million, I'm sure. But
hopefully I can get some of these that you named on the podcast. Well, Ruth, thanks so much for joining me today. I really valued and appreciated your voice on this topic. You definitely shared some really insightful things, and yeah, it's just made me a bit more aware. So
thank you
thanks
very
again.
much.
Thank you for tuning into Mindful AI. I hope that our conversation has provided you with valuable insights and perspectives on the fascinating developments in AI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media or via our website at Center Meditation to share your thoughts and suggestions for future episodes. Thanks again for listening to Mindful AI, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in the future.